Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I'm going to be doing a video on 10 fantasy standalones that I think you should read. Now we are all fantasy lovers, but the downside of fantasy in general is that often we are asked by the authors to read these mammoth series and trilogies that take up so much of our time, and on occasion we just want a standalone. We just want to read a book and enjoy it by itself without having to commit to a larger series. So here are 10 fantasy standalones that are full length. I will be doing a separate video on novellas, but these are full length novels that are standalones in the genre of fantasy. So let's get started. The first book that I'm going to recommend is The Curse of Chalion by Lois McMaster Bujold. This is a wonderful book centering around essentially a veteran character. He's a much older character than what we typically get in fantasy, and he is going back to his old town to look after a member of the royal family. There is a lot of political intrigue happening on in the background, and there is this really interesting magic system that is doing some stuff in the background, and we are essentially following this character as he's figuring out what is happening. Kazaril, the character that we follow, one of the best fantasy characters that I've ever read personally, and I think if you like really kind of classic medieval epic fantasy, you're going to really love this. The second book on my list is Uprooted by Naomi Novik. Now this is a book that I personally did not enjoy, but I think if you like the kind of whimsical fairy tale-esque type fantasy stories, then I think you would really enjoy it. So we are following this girl whose village is cursed, and to help lift the curse, a girl from said village has to go to this wizard, and stuff happens. We don't know what happens between the wizard and the girl, but he essentially trains them up and makes them into much more civilized women, and we don't really know like how or why he does this, but we follow this one character who kind of accidentally falls into this predicament. Now it is very vivid, it has lots of really beautiful imagery. I'm not really into that type of imagery, which is why I don't think I got on with it, but I think again if you like the kind of whimsical fairy tale type settings, then I think you would really enjoy it. It's also quite easy to get through, so if you just want like a weekend read, I think you could get through it fairly quickly. The next book on my list is The Magnificent Seven by Cameron Johnston. This is a book that I read earlier this year. It's such a good story about like a ragtag group of people who are trying to save a village. They all have their own motivations for saving that village. Chaos ensues when they're all together. It's just a really fun time. It doesn't take itself too seriously. It's quite grim, dark in nature, but there's lots of humour to counteract that. So if you're looking for something that's maybe a little bit more lighthearted, then I would recommend The Magnificent Seven. The only thing is that there is lots of swearing, very gory violence, so just be aware of that going into it. The next book that I will recommend is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, classic epic fantasy at its best. I don't think I really need to persuade you to read this one, but I read The Hobbit last year, and it's just such a beautiful story about wonderful characters who are trying to do what's right. If you're like new to fantasy and you haven't read any Tolkien, then I strongly recommend that you start with The Hobbit, because it just gives you just this tiny sliver of what to expect for the Lord of the Rings epicness. Next on my list is The Folding Knife by K.J. Parker. So interestingly enough, The Folding Knife doesn't actually have any magic in it, but it reads like a fantasy book, like a historical fantasy book. I have raved about The Folding Knife many times now. Alan has also raved about The Folding Knife many times now, and it is a story centering around the character of Basso, and we are essentially charting his rise and fall from being a bit of a nuisance to becoming this extremely powerful leader. It's just a really incredible insight into what it means to be a leader. We get some really interesting detail into how economies work, how mercantile banks work, how wars work, and it's just really fascinating. It combines two of my greatest loves, which is entrepreneurship and then fantasy and history. Like, it's such a bizarre mixture, but it just works. The next book on my list is The Black-Tongued Thief by Christopher Buehlman. So this is, I think, going to actually be a trilogy, but right now only the first book is out, and it does not end on a cliffhanger, so you can definitely read it as a standalone. It's kind of similar-ish to The Magnificent Seven. It is quite grim dark, but there is a really great relationship between the two main characters. We follow a male protagonist and then we follow this female protagonist, and I love that dynamic when you have a duo of a male and a female, and the male is a little bit immature, but the female is like totally solid and can totally beat him up. I love that type of pairing, and comedy ensues and chaos also ensues, and it's just a fun time. Like, again, it doesn't take itself too seriously. It's beautifully written. There's a really decent amount of world building as well, so it feels like a really kind of complete story. And the characters, I think you'll really buy into once you get through a couple of chapters. The next book is also a trilogy, but the first book does not end on a cliffhanger, and I read it as a standalone. I will read the rest of the trilogy later on, but I read the first book as a standalone, and that is The Last Mile in Sunder City by Luke Arnold. This is an urban fantasy book centering around a character who essentially has to solve a crime. It's quite grim in nature. I wouldn't say it's like totally grimdark. I think it gets darker as the series progresses. It's your kind of typical, you're following a detective as he tries to solve a crime, and there are clues here and there, and you're kind of trying to figure it out as you go along with the character. And it's just another fun time. Like, I think it's maybe a little bit more serious in tone compared to The Black Tongue Thief, but there's still some like funny bits into it. There's still some funny bits in it, and there's a lot of really interesting world building that is done that I personally really enjoyed. We're down to the last three. So the next one is The Winter Road by Adrian Selby. I've said this many times, The Winter Road was one of my favourite books of last year. Beautiful book about a woman who is trying to do what is right. It's just a wonderful character study of how people unwittingly become incredible leaders. I mean, she is a leader already, but she kind of, by the end of the book, her arc really shapes her up to be this incredible woman who people respect and love and would be willing to do anything for. Everybody should read this book because Adrian Selby's writing is just absolutely stunning. It is a little bit of a slow burn, but it's one of those books where the emotional payoff is so worth it when you get to the end of the book. Definitely read The Winter Road because it's so good, guys. It is quite dark in nature. Quite a few of these books are grimdark. It is quite dark in nature, so again, if you don't like tons of violence, then I would probably stay away from it. I don't really recall there being too much swearing, but there is a lot of violence, so normally where there's violence, there's swearing, let's be honest. So if you're looking for something a little bit grittier, then I definitely recommend The Winter Road. All right, the penultimate book that I'm going to recommend is The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wong. I read this book 3-4 years ago, and I personally didn't like it as much as everybody else did. It's such a loved book on BookTube, like everybody loves it. I personally thought there were issues with it. I just didn't really connect with any of the characters. I did really like the character of Masaki. I think she's an amazing character, but we're essentially following a young boy as he discovers more about his life and about the political situation of that world. And then we follow a bunch of other characters. We follow his friend, we follow his mother, Masaki, and we're essentially looking at the different dynamics at play. And it's really interesting because there is a lot of historical context that I learned from this book, and I loved it for that reason. But there was something missing for me. I don't know what it was. There was something missing for me, but just because it was missing for me doesn't mean that it won't be missing for you. So I think if you're looking for something that is maybe a bit more historical in nature, but also has some magic, then I think you would really enjoy this. It is also Asian fantasy, so if you want to get out of the kind of classic medieval Western fantasy, then this is one that I definitely recommend. Okay, last but definitely not least is Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. Oh, Earthsea is so good. I didn't appreciate it when I was reading it, but I appreciate it more now that I've reflected on it a lot more. Earthsea is split into 4 parts. We are following one main character. He is a magician, and we're essentially following him on his adventures. I don't want to give any more than that because I think it's one of those stories. I mean, I read it not knowing much about it, and I'm so glad that I did, because I don't think you'll fully appreciate the beauty of each part if you go into it knowing what to expect. Ursula K. Le Guin's prose is some of the most beautiful prose I've ever read, and I cannot wait to read more of her stuff. And the fact that it's split into parts makes it a little bit more palatable. Each part has a very specific plot, but then it's joined up by this overarching plot, if that makes sense. It's not going to feel like a continuous story in some regards, but it definitely is, and you will realise that as you go through each part. The character of Ged is a really great character, a character that I've actually been thinking a lot about recently, bizarrely enough. But I just think that if you're looking for like some classic fantasy with beautiful prose, then you've got to read Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. All right, that's it, folks. That's my list of top 10 fantasy standalones that I recommend. Let me know if you've read any of these. Let me know if there are any that you would add to this list, because I'm always keen to read more standalones myself. Let's take the conversation down below, and I will see you in the next video. Stay safe and take care. Bye.